Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Andrew Koutnik, PhD, is a researcher studying the influence of nutrition and metabolism on health, disease, and performance. He originally began his research path at Florida State University in exercise science, studying the influence of nutrition, exercise, supplementation, and environmental extremes on health-based outcomes in normal and clinical populations. Personally, Andrew Koutnik also uses exercise, nutrition, and lifestyle factors to manage type 1 diabetes for over a decade. Type 1 diabetes has and continues to give an incredible in-depth personal journey into the world of our metabolism, how it works, how day-to-day life influences it, and how these changes on metabolism can have far-reaching effects over other aspects of our physiology. This combination of researching nutrition and exercise and also dealing with its benefits and consequences daily as a type 1 diabetic created a strong appreciation for the metabolic role that nutrition and lifestyle can play into disease prevention and management. Andrew is currently involved in ongoing research projects exploring how metabolism influences and is influenced by health, disease, lifestyle, and performance. Dr. Andrew Koutnik, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
Casey, I appreciate it. It is an honor to be here, and I appreciate the introduction. Man, that's awesome. It's always weird and cool to hear a little bit of a background on yourself. But yeah, so I appreciate it, man. Great opportunity.
You've done some cool stuff. You deserve a very cool introduction because you've done some very cool stuff. It's interesting, as I was kind of thinking about what we'd be discussing today, there are so many different topics that we could be talking about. Your research is so wide ranging. I find it fascinating. We are definitely going to be talking about performance and some of your experience with something that I've used for a majority of my career, which is a metabolic cart and measuring fat oxidation in athletes and also everyday people that were, using that equipment at a gym that I used to work for. But before we do that, I came across your work. I've been familiar with your work for a while, but I came across you personally at the Symposium for Metabolic Health in San Diego. We didn't actually get to connect in person, unfortunately, but you gave an amazing presentation about type 1 diabetes. Before we deep dive into that and into your own personal story, I'm just curious, how was your experience in San Diego at the symposium? What did you think of it?
So it was a unique opportunity where I could actually drive to this because I'm actually in Santa Barbara, California right now. And so being able to drive to a conference like that, and if no one's been to California, it is frankly so beautiful. And so it was a pleasant 3.5, 4 hour drive. Really love that. And it's a unique conference. And we were talking a little bit about this offline before. When you think about these massive conferences, there's neuroscience, experimental biology, American Diabetes Association. You can choose any mainstay institutional conference that might be out there, and you're talking like tens of thousands of people who attend these, and these are kind of the big go-tos for a lot of people in a respective field. But in those conferences, you're in some of the biggest conference centers in the entire United States, San Diego, Chicago, Orlando, the list goes on, and then you really lose the opportunity to really connect one-on-one with people. And we do research a lot of times on the impact nutrition has and lifestyle, such as exercise, on health, disease, and performance, with a particular interest on all the way from diseases such as diabetes, people at risk for, people living with it, because I also live with type 1, but also the most elite level performers, talking about operator performers like those who are astronauts and/or special forces communities. So we span the gamut and with a real key focus on the idea of actually taking research and translating it to real world application. It's one thing to study these things and get into the nitty gritty of how something works, or if you see a key metric of change. We actually want to do things that we think could actually make a meaningful difference and translate research to action. So that's something it's pertinent to me. And what I find in a conference revolving, this was the Metabolic Health Symposium, and it's a low carb focus. And we've done research on low carb for a decade or more now. At least I have, specifically, many others there who have done this for much longer. And it just gives you a really fun opportunity to meet with other people who are focused on that topic and learn from their experience, both personally and from other researchers in the space. And it really helps you take a more focused approach to some of the nuances within nutrition and how it spans, not just for, in my case, when I talked about type 1 diabetes, I didn't get a chance to talk about our performance work there, but just type 1, but also see how nutrition has far-reaching implications on other disease states. And I find that to be a really cool experience, which inevitably guarantees that you have one-on-one interactions with many of the conference goers. And that's a special opportunity. It actually, it takes it away from a purely academic experience to a really one-on-one personal experience. And those are a very special place, especially having gone to virtually every type of conference there is. These are the fun ones.
Wow, that's really cool. One thing that I've observed is exactly what you're explaining, like the connections. And it's interesting to see doctors connecting with doctors, and they're associating with each other, and they're asking each other interesting questions. Lay people like myself connecting with other lay people and trying to understand what people's stories are and meeting new people and that kind of thing. And also the interaction between the two, like lay people being able to, talk to Georgia Ede, for example, like give me a break. Like she was giving everybody, 5 to 10 minutes to just chat her up about anything as she was doing her book signings. And it's incredible to have that interaction. And I'm really curious, since you have had that type of experience in all types of conferences, I've been to a few different ones as well. What is the difference in the energy level in the conference? Because presumably everybody in this conference was low carb, ketogenic, carnivore, whatever. I look around on Saturday. It's a beautiful day in San Diego. Like you said, it's an amazing place. Everybody's there. Nobody left to go to the beach, and everybody is super engaged. Like an hour or two after lunch, everybody's sitting there quietly, patiently after hours and hours of very complex presentations. What do you notice about like the energy itself, regardless of whatever the content is in this conference versus say like a normal like medical conference that you'd attend?
Usually when you go to a normal medical conference, you have like seating for like 300 to 1,000 people, sometimes 10,000 people, and well, thousands of people, maybe 10,000 might be exaggeration, in one single spot. And so I don't want to call it stale, but you're not really getting kind of that energetic interaction, because just like we're sitting here talking to each other, it's virtual, it's not actually in person, but you get a feeling, there's just a known response to the engagement of one person to another in person that has a positive impact, usually, unless it's a negative interaction, it usually has a positive impact on your lived experience in that moment. And so it's uncomparable, because there's no way you're going to know all 10,000 people in one of these massive conferences. And so you're kind of walking past people. You hope to catch someone and have that kind of intimate one-on-one interaction, and it's meaningful on a personal level that extends beyond just what you're learning. And at a conference like that, it's inevitable that you interact one-on-one with individuals who deeply care about what you're talking about. It's not just it just takes it to another level. So yeah, the energy, with quotes around it, because define energy however you want to. It's just it's an uplifting experience that you can really get to connect with people, and so I thoroughly enjoy those experiences.
Pretty special to see Dave Feldman, of all people, stepping up to the microphone to ask you a question and offer his congratulations on your amazing work. That had to be quite meaningful for you.
Yeah, so Dave, it's interesting. So a lot of people who probably listen to your podcast, and many who probably don't know of Dave, but it's interesting. Dave, my understanding is the very first conference Dave attended, where he was starting to approach people and try to, hey, look, I have this interesting data. I could be wrong, Dave, correct me here if I am, but he went to the metabolic health, now called the summit, but it was actually a different global, I forget what they called it before, but it was run by someone named Angela Poff, and now Victoria. And but this was like years back, like almost a half decade back, when this was the first one ever. It was in Tampa with Dom D'Agostino, and he was involved in that. That's why I was in his lab. And Dave came up to me at that conference, like on the side, the first or second day, and said, hey, look, I have these really interesting lipid data. It just goes all over the map whenever I eat these foods. Like, I don't think it's consistent. At this point, I was hyper focused on nutrition as a disease mitigation strategy. And of course, you come out the gate almost immediately appreciating, if you study anything about ketogenic diets, that when you flip from a very high carbohydrate based approach, which most people are doing, to a low carbohydrate strategy, you see these changes in lipids. We can talk more about this when we talk about fat oxidation and gas exchange, and the term you use is metabolic card. But you appreciate there's this wide sweeping change in lipids. And so he was essentially getting at this idea that, oh man, I'm seeing these crazy changes. and we had many discussions in the lab at this point about obviously this widespread lipid change, but obviously this increase in LDL. That's a common point of discussion around these diets, because there's all this positive data coming out at this point. I mean, this is when you go on Google Trends, and ketogenic diet not only outcompeted every other type of diet on Google Trends, it was hitting a peak moment at that stage. And so, we were contemplating a lot of the what you were learning from the people out in the community about why you should or shouldn't consider one of these approaches. And so he came up with an interesting conversation around lipids. And I'm being totally honest with you. When someone comes up to you and says, I have zero research experience whatsoever, I just see these crazy changes on a personal level, I was like, that's incredible, because that's actually what got me into science. If I'm being totally frank, I have type 1 diabetes, and that's why I became so fascinated with going to the depths with this. But when he was speaking to me, I was like, hey, let me introduce you to a few people over here who are really ingrained on that topic. And I believe that was the first conference he ever attended, and kind of jumped in face first. And I don't know if I was the first person he spoke to at the conference, but I remember passing him to introductions to a few people there, and then come to see where he is now. And the impact that him and the research that he has actually generated that has touched on such a key topic is kind of insane, to be honest with you. And credit to him for what he's done with those last, what it seems like 5-6 years at this point, and made a massive impact.
Dude, if I could go back and record that initial conversation between the two of you, and like you said, like the implications of that one conversation, whoever you must have introduced him to, like what that led to now, looking back, and what that will lead to in the future, it's absolutely staggering. What a special moment. It's such a cool thing to look back on.
I don't want to take any credit from him, because he was so clearly on a mission that it would have been me or someone else. And again, I don't even know if I was the first person. I just know that when he came and spoke to me, I'm like, hey, go speak to this person and this person, who was intimately tied to the changes in lipids and its impact on overall health. But I remember at that conference, he was dead set, man. And so I don't think it would have, if it wasn't me, it was going to be someone else. So
these engineers, man, they're such nerds. You know what I mean? That's so awesome. I love it. Dude, okay, so tell us a little bit about your convergence between your own personal health and your interest in this. You mentioned that you were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. You kind of alluded to the fact that that maybe led to how you got interested in health and metabolism, or did your interest in health and metabolism come first? How did that all play out in your own personal story?
Yes, so it came first, but the in-depth nature, to the point of wanting to research it as a career path, came after type 1 diabetes. So I started as an obese kid. So in adolescence, I was obese. I was by definition obese, and I definitely looked obese. I wasn't like, oh, I'm a massive jacked kid. No. I was obese, and I attempted to lose weight for 5 years. Using all sorts of different strategies, exercise, blah, 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 blah. My family was a very health conscious family. And my father had had done marathons. So my mom, well, at least half marathons, and they were super active. My aunt and uncle had actually run. Well, my uncle had run over 20 marathons, climbed mountains, done multiple century rides. And they were inspirations to me. And so we were very health conscious, but I still became obese. A lot of that I could look back and explain that on the food environment. There's a stage where I started playing video games and had a lack of activity, but at one point I was very active. But either way, I tried almost everything to lose weight, and I kept failing. And I was about at the point where I was going to completely give up. And then finally, one of the most key things I find when it comes to a journey on weight loss for me personally, and what you see actually that's evidence-based or supported by the evidence, is that there's a degree of accountability that really helps people, regardless of what diet you're on or what you're doing, right? It could be an exercise program. It could be a low carb diet. It could be any of these things, right? But having some degree of accountability with someone who knows how to help guide you on that journey is incredibly important, because at least in that moment where you're, hey, what should I do here? Should I follow this type of food? Or should I have this? Or I'm kind of struggling with at this moment. You have someone who can provide tips and tools and tricks for you along the way that really helps ease and reduce the barriers to success on this path. So that could be a coach, it could be whatever. But I actually hired a coach when I was I think it was like 15 years old. I didn't know. My parents actually helped, and hired someone who was very well known in doing nutritional approaches to help people. And it was not by any means a ketogenic style strategy. It was frankly caloric restriction and engaging in more exercise with a whole food approach. And I lost weight, right? But it was just the idea that I had accountability. It wasn't easy. I was hungry a lot. There might have been more effective ways to do this that involved less suffering, but ultimately I did lose weight. And that was transformative on my journey because it really made me appreciate the prolonged and learned journey to success. When it comes to weight loss, and that's why I sympathize so much with people who actually are struggling with obesity, which unfortunately is well over a third of the population. If you account for overweight on top of that, you're talking about 3/4 of the population in the United States and at least 2/3 in other developed countries. So I sympathize deeply with that because I tried everything and I didn't have the knowledge I have now. So in the absence of that information, you just go and try and find random tidbits of information, and it may be good and it may not be good. But ultimately I failed for year on end, but I was so motivated to not be stuck where I was that I kept showing up to try to do something different. And eventually I was successful, but I very much appreciate the neurobiological feedback mechanisms that make it so hard to lose weight and maintain weight loss. But I eventually found myself being successful at that. Completely independent of that, Casey, a year later, I get diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And a lot of people would say, okay, well, you had weight loss and you have type 1 diabetes. Those things must be connected. No. The timeline doesn't make a lot of sense for it to be connected. There is a very small percentage chance it might be, but it's extremely unlikely that I would, in adolescence, had a prolonged beta cell autoimmune attack that lasted over a year. So it's almost certainly completely disconnected from one another. And I get diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. Now, keep in mind, when I had lost weight and I was finally successful, I had flipped my mindset from, okay, I don't want to be, I'm not obese anymore. I had lost weight, but now I want to do the exact opposite. I'm going to compensate for being obese for this many years, and I'm going to become the biggest, strongest, fastest bodybuilder of all time. And so I was so hyper-focused on image because as a kid, of course, when you're obese, one of the hardest things to deal with isn't some metabolic health problem. It's how you look and how you're treated by your peers as a result of how you look. And so that's really what imprinted on my brain. But when I lost weight, I'm like, okay, now I'm going to become the ultra opposite of that, which everyone seems to respect as a kid, these super jacked, muscles, And so I started tracking like every gram of all the food I was eating. And I became super in the weeds, Casey, of actually trying to optimize for muscle and performance. But then when I got diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, a crazy story in and of itself. When I get diagnosed and I'm in the hospital for 2 weeks, in the ICU for 1 week, my blood sugar was 6 times higher than normal, not realizing that I was probably a day or two away from not sitting here today and no longer being alive. Realizing that in the hospital, I was going to be injecting myself with medicine that not only could kill me, but was also the most essential medication or molecule, frankly, in my metabolism to sustain life, which is insulin. And so when you combine all those things together, it took my passion for utilizing lifestyle and nutrition to optimize health and performance, and now it became health, disease, and performance, where the independent management of key components of your lifestyle has such a much broader and bigger impact in the context of type 1 diabetes. So, for example, just to give your audience some awareness, with type 1 diabetes, you have constant access to your glucose levels. So nowadays we have continuous glucose monitors. A lot of people in the general health population wear these devices. Well, actually, the reason they do that is because of type 1 diabetes. The community, those were developed for people with type 1 diabetes to be able to track their glucose levels all the time instead of just doing finger sticks. Obviously, the consequences of high and low blood sugars are massive. We can talk more about that later, but now we can track it 24/7. Well, on top of that, we're also administering all our essential requirements of insulin 24/7. Okay. So as a result, we have 24/7 access to the amount of insulin required in each moment, and also the corresponding glucose change at each moment. And as a result, we have the two most potent and important molecules, in my opinion, in metabolism that are coupled to one another with 24/7 access to that information. So what does that mean? That means someone with type 1 diabetes has better, in my opinion, insight into the inner workings of their metabolism and how lifestyle and environmental changes directly impact those key biomarkers. We're talking glucose, influx and change, but also things like insulin load and sensitivity. And obviously, these are key to metabolic health. Well, that was abundantly, I was abundantly aware of this at this time, and then became so fascinated on how to optimize it for being bigger, stronger, faster, but also there was a health component now. I was intimately aware the second you get diagnosed, what it felt like to have high blood sugar levels and low blood sugar levels. And this is observed on a smaller scale, even in what we would deem somewhat healthy individuals, that very high glucose levels can have biological consequence. And sometimes it's biological consequences that manifest into symptoms such as fatigue, irritability, loss of concentration. If you go low, you can become shaky, irritable. And so you immediately resonate with that. But actually, people in the general population who don't have access to these tools, who may be, just like the average American, overweight or obese and on their way to prediabetes, which over half of adults in the United States actually do, and 80% of them don't know it. That when you start eating large meals, like a lot of people have talked about during lunch, they have this post-lunch lull, like wanting to take a nap after lunch. And actually, if they were to observe the change in their blood glucose levels and the change in insulin requirements that actually come as a result of that meal, they may appreciate why some meals actually make them feel tired and lethargic, while other meals don't. But in type 1 diabetes, you see this all the time. And I was becoming more and more aware of the advantage that this provided me in daily life. And I knew, frankly, that athletes, particularly those who were very concerned with developing very, very large, like things like muscle tissue, like in the context of bodybuilders, that this was a potent anabolic stimulus. And frankly, arguably the most potent anabolic stimulus. It is the most potent anabolic molecule in the entire body, more so than people think about when they think of anabolics. They think of steroids or anabolic steroid use, like testosterone or other things like that. No. Insulin is the most potent anabolic molecule the body sees. And of course, in the context of type 1 diabetes, you're actually providing that every single day. In the complete absence of insulin, you die. And too much insulin, you die. And in every single day with type 1 diabetes, you're coupling these feedback loops of 24/7 glucose and 24/7 insulin, ultimately to stay in this very unique and often very, very difficult sweet spot that maintains normal health. And in the concept of glucose, that window is extremely tight, 70 to 120 milligrams per deciliter, which is around 4.5 to 6.6 millimoles for people who may not be in the United States. So that's not an easy task to do. In fact, the vast majority of people with type 1 diabetes never achieve that. And so I became so fascinated on this interaction between metabolism, health, disease management, and ultimately performance. And that really led me on my career path to try to understand how to optimize every single one of those. Because one thing to do research to understand what's happening under the hood, and which is just frankly fascinating and very intellectually stimulating. It's a whole nother thing to think, how do I actually translate to the lived experience of people with this disease who are trying to improve their performance or just better their overall health? And that's something that really resonates with me and something I'm actively engaged with across the board. So a long-winded answer to say here, Casey, that my journey with type 1 diabetes and ultimately a focus on metabolic health was a long one that started with obesity. It was taken to a whole nother level with type 1 diabetes and never really left me. It became actually one of the most valuable assets I've ever had as a researcher. I have learned more from my personal experience with type 1 diabetes than I have from any particular textbook or any research experiment that I've ever conducted. What those textbooks did for me, what this, advanced, education, PhD in biomedical science, et cetera, blah, 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 blah. All that did was teach me how the changes I was observing were occurring, and then ultimately allowed me to take that information and optimize it for bettering health, improving disease management, and ultimately improving performance.
Wow, that is fascinating. If you're listening and not watching, to believe that you were obese for one day in your life is very, very hard to believe. You're in absolutely amazing shape. That's crazy. What an amazing story. And I love that last point that like your lived experience gave you all of the wisdom that you needed, let alone some of the, the knowledge that you gained with all the textbooks and learnings and all the research you've done after that. I find that very fascinating. And that's one thing that really jumped out to me about your presentation is you're talking about some of these technologies that we have, like the continuous glucose monitors and constant insulin monitoring and insulin pumps and all these amazing things. Yet the targets that we have for normal people with type 1 diabetes are embarrassingly high. They're way outside the range that you're talking about as far as where we need to control glucose. And again, the thing that stood out for me on your presentation was with all of these technologies, why are we not seeing improvements? Yet when we focus on something even more simple like the diet, it seems like we're seeing amazing improvements in health and lifespan and all these amazing things. Like, how do you reconcile those facts?
So that question actually goes back over 100 years, where nutrition was the mainstay intervention to prolong the life of a patient who was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes before insulin was discovered. We actually wrote an article with Belinda Leonards and David Loeb at Boston Children's and Harvard Med describing this century-old concept, where actually it was standard of care for people with type 2 diabetes and obesity in the 1700s. If you look at historical books, actually catalog nutrition in the context of diabetes. But when you start talking about the evolution of what diet should be recommended or the impact of diet in general, it's a very unique story because in the context of type 1 diabetes, you're this unique, what I call insulin knockout model, where you don't produce insulin, you have to administer it on your own. So you have complete control over your insulin, okay? And as a result, you can then see how food, exercise, sleep, all these different components ultimately change glucose while having total control over the amount of insulin you administer. So for an example, what does that mean? So let's say that one day I wake up and I was, let's say today, Casey, I take 2 units of insulin for a set meal of a certain amount of protein, fat, and carbohydrates. And then over the next month, I happen to gain like 5-10 pounds. Who knows why the reason was, but I just did. That same meal, all other factors controlled, I'm now taking 4 units of insulin. And so where someone else may not realize that, oh man, my insulin requirements are going up because I'm becoming less insulin sensitive. That in the context of type 1 diabetes, you gain direct access to that type of information. And if you have the advanced knowledge about the impact insulin can have and insulin resistance can have, you can now translate the potential long-term health implications of these subtle changes in lifestyle. That's just one example. But when you start talking about the impact of nutrition, so you're alluding at something that I think is not fully accepted, Casey. The idea that nutrition has a potent impact, there is emergent evidence that it could be, if it or frankly is, the most potent lifestyle factor in regulating glucose control. And I would argue that that spans beyond just type 1 diabetes. But what you see in type 1 diabetes is the full, clear, unencumbered resolution on the true potency of nutrition has on a day, basically a meal by meal basis. So we know that in the context of food, carbohydrates has the most potent impact on glucose. So postprandial, when you eat carbohydrates, particularly starchy, sugary carbohydrates, you see a very rapid spike. And ultimately, it should come down in the presence of insulin over time. Now, what's different in type 1 diabetes is that people with type 1 diabetes, because of the lack of endogenous insulin production, we have to administer insulin exogenously. And it's a bit slower. The fastest acting insulins in exogenous form are about 3 to 4-fold slower than what happens for someone like yourself, Casey, assuming you don't have type 1 diabetes. And so it's delayed. And so, and beyond that, beyond the delay in insulin to be able to manage very rapid acting glycemically impactful foods like carbohydrates, is the fact that in type 1 diabetes, the absence of endogenous insulin also causes an elevation of something called glucagon. we know that glucagon is actually elevated not only at basal levels in people with type 1, but postprandial. So that means that every single meal, there is a hyper response to food in type 1. So in type 1 diabetes, it really gives you the best insight over, and I would argue, any other disease on the potency of nutrition in managing metabolic health. We also know in the context of type 1 diabetes, we've learned more about the impact of glycemic control than any other disease. In fact, our appreciation for the negative impact of glucose comes from type 1 diabetes, not type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is where we've learned that independent of weight, independent of elevated body weight, elevated adiposity levels, elevated lipid levels, usually normal weight individuals, just the absence of insulin in the body and elevated and variable glucose levels, so essentially just elevated and variable glucose levels, drives increased risk for alternative leading causes of death, about a 10-fold higher increased risk for heart disease or macrovascular disease, and then ultimately an expectation that every patient is expected to have at least one long-term complication in their lifetime, with an 11 to 18-year shortened life expectancy. And the leading risk factor for all of these in type 1 diabetes is glucose control. So in the context of type 1 diabetes, we have learned more about the impact of glucose in long-term health than any other disease out there. In fact, this is the foundation of where that has been discovered, and then translated outside of it where it is relevant to other people. But we have conducted studies because there was this on the impact of carbohydrates. And the reason we were so fascinated about this, besides the idea that we know that carbohydrates have the most potent impact on postprandial glycemic control, and it is the most potent lifestyle factor on glycemic management in a dose-dependent manner. So the more you consume, the higher glucose levels go post-consumption, is that we also knew that when people were starting to restrict carbohydrates, that they seem to have improvements in glycemic control. However, a lot of the evidence on this was very spotty, meaning that it was case reports or maybe an observation over here or over there, and there wasn't this really robust, what people expect to see is called randomized controlled trial style evidence. And there's value to that discussion about why randomized controlled trials are so important or not, but not to get too much into the weeds. What our team did, and a part of what I presented at the Metabolic Health Symposium, which is getting to the final stretch here, and hopefully will be published soon, is we gathered and consolidated every single study in the context of type 1 diabetes, this unique disease where you have total control and observation of glucose and insulin 24/7, and looked at every study that ever published with a confirmed patient with type 1 diabetes, a confirmed time on a set amount of carbohydrates, and a disease biomarker that resulted from that time on carbohydrates. And we pulled every single study. We reviewed over 8,000 articles. This has been a multi-year process, and ultimately came down to do what we do is these large cross-study analysis called meta-regressions and systematic reviews. And that included around 46,000 patients with type 1 diabetes, looking at cross studies on the impact of carbohydrates have on things like HbA1c, which is a long-term measure of glucose control, or total insulin load, which is a surrogate marker for insulin sensitivity or resistance, and other things like blood lipids. And what we found is that carbohydrates, when you go from the average intake of carbohydrates in type 1 diabetes, which is around what the general population is, which is 45% of your total calories coming from carbohydrates, that if you start consuming more carbohydrates than that, which some people recommend, like, okay, consume less fat, consume more carbs, you see no improvement in things like HbA1c or insulin from going from the average intake to even higher carbs. Because in essence, what you're doing is you're also, by default, almost certainly reducing fat intake when you increase carbs. Protein is usually relatively stable. And then when you go from that average intake down, however, there is a unique statistical phenomenon where there is a clear, significant impact on reducing carbohydrate intake all the way down to hypothetical zero in a dose-dependent manner. And what's interesting about this, Casey, is that almost no study, only 10% of high carbohydrate diet studies showed that patients were able to hit the American Diabetes Association target of less than 7% HbA1c. When you got to moderate carbohydrate, so a slight reduction in carbohydrate from just the norm, you see around 20% of 20% of studies observed hitting this target. When you got to low carbohydrate, and this isn't even this very low carbohydrate ketogenic, it's just somewhere between 50 to 130 grams of carbohydrates per day. Not the very low end, but kind of this kind of lower than what most people are consuming. Over 70% of those studies showed hitting the target, and 100% of a very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet hit those targets. And we can uncover the why we're actually talking about 7%, which is not even close to normal, and why those are set in there. We can dive in it, but in essence, to say that this is the largest study ever conducted, which consolidated all the evidence in the context of this disease, which is a very unique disease for insight on metabolic health, and show that carbohydrates had a dose-dependent response on key measures of long-term health and disease risk, like HbA1c, insulin load. But it didn't have any negative impact on blood lipids, which was kind of shocking because you would not expect that on a patient-by-patient basis or outside of the disease of type 1 diabetes. But we didn't see any negative impacts on lipids from carbohydrate restriction when looking at the observation of all these studies combined. So it really lent itself to illustrate that nutrition is arguably one of the most potent potential levers you can pull in regulating disease outcomes in a disease like type 1 diabetes, where food is so intimately linked to the day-to-day management of the disease, specifically through glycemic control and insulin, but also that has long-term implications on risk over the lifespan, which is quite consequential.
That is absolutely fascinating. I remember seeing that slide that you're describing, where you're taking all these studies and you see the slide and it just drops. And you're right, it is linear. That the further the carbohydrates went, the lower the HbA1c. And you talk about all these implications. And yes, it's like you said, there's implications for obviously people with type 1 diabetes, but it's implied for everybody. And at the very end of that presentation, I remember you said you had kind of a dream scenario of something you would like to see. That unfortunately, I don't know that you're ever going to be able to see that with a large population in your lifetime, because the guidelines are so bad, like you've alluded to. They're so terrible. But can you say, like, again, based on those implications and those studies, what are some of the things that you could envision in the future had we changed the guidelines around what we could tell type 1 diabetics to eat?
So there's 4 key facts that I think is really my dream for people living with this particular disease. And then we can unpack the guidelines a bit and maybe some of the set measures of success that a lot of the institutional bodies have put out there, because I think that's important to also talk about. When we think about type 1 diabetes specifically, and this also translates outside of type 1 diabetes to just the general well person, one of my dreams for type 1, which is observed in only 1% of the patient population in type 1 diabetes, and unfortunately less and less common in the general population, is normal glycemia. The idea that patients can actually get to and on average achieve blood sugar levels within the normal physiologic range. Whereas the vast majority of people with type 1 diabetes are currently living an average blood sugar around 183 milligrams per deciliter, with a standard deviation above it 60 milligrams per deciliter, and below it an additional 60 milligrams per deciliter. So a total range of over 120 milligrams per deciliter above and below an average that is almost double what is normal. And so, my dream for people with type 1 diabetes is that not just 1% of the population in this disease is achieving that, but that 100% of patients are able to achieve that, or have access to tools and technologies or just strategies like nutrition that allow them to get there. My second dream was that patients would live complication-free. Right now, it is expected that every single patient over their lifetime will have at least, with type 1 diabetes, at least one long-term complication. And that is inextricably linked to glycemic control. It's the number 1 risk factor for virtually every major complication in type 1 diabetes. And so achieving number one almost certainly parlays into helping improve and get to this idea of zero complications, not just expecting at least one, but having zero complications with this disease. The third thing was 0 days of lost life due to this disease. Every patient right now is expected on average in a developed country with access to some of the best tools that you can possibly have, medical advancements, technological advancements. Despite all of these, we're expected to live around 11 to 18 years shorter in the developed Western world. Whereas if you go to undeveloped countries, the years of lost life actually go to over 40 years of lost life in undeveloped countries with this disease. So my goal and dream is that 0 years of lost life will manifest as a result of improving the actual therapies that we provide these patients. And this gets to the last point, which is all those talk about the long-term implications. But more than anything, I just want to reduce the burden this disease has on patients on a day in and day out basis. We know that just subtle increases in blood sugar above the normal, i.e. termed hyperglycemia, or below normal, i.e. hypoglycemia. And your audience can just go to Google right now and type in symptoms of hyperglycemia and hypoglycemia and see that these are mental and physical health symptoms. You know, fatigue, loss of concentration, irritability, anxiousness or anxiety, and ravenous hunger. You know, all these things are just basically the lived experience of living outside of normal glycemic range, which again I will state is what 99% of people with this disease are doing. And of course, if you talk about type 2 diabetes, you know, obviously by definition, for you to be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, you have to be living in hyperglycemia. And you also have much higher levels of variability around blood glucose levels. And for those who may not be type 1 or type 2, the vast majority of Americans right now, over 50%, 20 years of age or higher, even as of 10 years ago, have prediabetes. And that means, again, a manifestation of higher and more variable glucose levels, because all of these, prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, and type 1 diabetes, are actually diagnosed based on glycemic criteria. Although what's under the hood underlying that elevation in glucose is actually a little bit distinct from each one of these. Ultimately, we know these elevated and variable glucose levels, higher insulin needs, are ultimately causing elevated risk for long-term complications, which ultimately we certainly know now that there are tools and tricks that seem to have a dramatic impact on improving that. But there's still a lack of appreciation and acceptance that something like, let's say we talked about a very low carbohydrate diet or a ketogenic diet could do that. But as a result, because we don't have these long-term randomized controlled trials in the context of type 1 diabetes, despite it being standard of care 100 years ago, we still don't have a randomized controlled trial over 7 days in length for ketogenic diet and type 1 diabetes, despite its promise, despite this large multi-study systematic analysis of all these studies. We lack that kind of gold standard evidence, which allows for a lot of healthcare practitioners and institutions like the American Diabetes Association to provide recommendations around these. And so patients are often lost. They're often left to their own journey if they're hoping to achieve normal glycemia, often without healthcare support and without any standard guidelines on how to do it safely. And that's where we stand today, Casey, in the context of type 1 diabetes, on how to manage with what appear to be some of the most promising tools out there, such as modulating carbohydrate intake in the context of type 1. And as a result, the longest ever study that had ever been conducted, Casey, looking at just a ketogenic diet in general, was in GLUT1 deficiency disorder, where it was a 10-year observation from pre to post, just in some symptoms of GLUT1 deficiency. But that's a very rare scenario. There had never been a study, frankly, anywhere close to that in length in any other context. And most of these studies that are actually controlling diet and actually showing data before the diet was initiated to post-diet initiation and anywhere in between are at most usually 3 months. And I think the longest was around 1 to 2 years in the context of type 1 diabetes. Well, we actually conducted an observation of a patient, i.e. myself, actually undergoing a ketogenic diet for 10 years, because I had actually had data when I was doing research looking at, I had DEXA scans on body composition and bone mineral density. I had all my food and training logs. I had maintained the same medication requirements. And I knew that over a 10-year period, I had maintained my body weight plus or minus 5%. I had maintained the same caloric intake. I had not changed my insulin regimen or general diabetes management strategy. And I had all these advanced metrics pre to post and throughout. And I thought it was very interesting, not only on a personal level to understand what was happening, but it was also the largest or the longest longitudinal data there ever was in the context of type 1 diabetes, where we also, even outside of type 1 diabetes as well, where we actually looked at advanced cardiovascular measurements to see, is there increased risk of doing these diets on cardiovascular health, which is one of the key reasons people are apprehensive about a ketogenic diet, is these elevated lipid levels and long-term health. So we really tried to address these big gaps in the literature that are present to understand the long-term implications these diets may have, because they seem like they have incredible promise. I have done a ketogenic diet, obviously, because we did this case report on myself for over having done this diet for over 10 years and maintained normal glycemia, lower insulin load, and had no adverse effects on cardiovascular health. In fact, in many ways, my cardiovascular health far exceeded that of the non-diabetic population on average, for matching for age, sex, and a bunch of other factors. So it certainly, and the only modifiable factor, because activity was kept consistent, was this change in macronutrient composition independent of calories. So yeah, I mean, it ultimately illustrated that there appeared to be profound therapeutic potential to this diet over the long term. But this gets back to the bigger concept of what you asked, which is, we're talking about, a disease where there's advanced progression of cardiovascular disease at much higher risk for alternate leading causes of death, where glucose is the primary risk factor, but yet you gain insight on glucose and insulin 24/7. But what that gives you is advanced insight into what you can do to modulate your own metabolic health and what strategies can be best applied. And a lot of the research we've been focusing on, these very low carbohydrate ketogenic diets, has been focused on that because of the extreme promise that they actually give. And we're very hopeful that a lot of the research that we have done and will be doing ongoing and will be published soon will help illustrate just how far reaching the potential of these may or may not be in managing disease.
That is stunning. And the whole thing just makes me realize, like, on a personal level, how important this is. I think about you and your story, and if you hadn't have, wanted to improve your obesity at age 15, hadn't hired a coach, your path could have been completely, totally different. And it's like you said, I remember you made this point in the presentation. It's like the patient, the individual, somebody like yourself, one person is rogue. They're on their own. They don't have support. They have these recommendations that are not great to eat lots of carbohydrates and then to cover the carbohydrates with the insulin and all those implications, everything that you're saying. It's just on that individual level. It's such a shame that this is not out there and is not even being suggested or presented as an option for an individual patient.
Yeah, it's why I have taken off my researcher hat many times and just put on my advocacy hat, because not necessarily to advocate for any one approach, but to advocate for the awareness of options that patients can have available to them right now that seem promising. Because at the end of the day, we've also, on top of that, Casey, we've also just completed a data collection on surveying an international survey of patients or caregivers of people living with type 1 diabetes. And one of the common reasons why nutrition hasn't been a focus of research in type 1 diabetes, in fact, technology is published on about 4.5 times more than diet is in the context of type 1 diabetes, despite diet being the most potent lifestyle factor affecting glycemic control. And when we did this international survey, we asked people, do you feel like diet has a big impact on your disease? And what they said is the vast overwhelming majority, 2/3, said yes, it had a huge impact on their disease management. It just demystifies the idea that is this separation between what often is these funding bodies describing what should and should not be funding to what actually patients say is impacting them on a daily basis. And clearly food is one of the big ones. There's no knock against technology and resources that have gone into things like that, because we've gotten CGMs out of it. We've gotten pumps, these things called automatic insulin delivery systems. Like there's a lot of things that have come out of the technology and tools in the context of type 1 diabetes that have then translated outside of type 1 diabetes to help other people in other diseases. But that said, it just goes to illustrate, and this hasn't been published yet, and it will be forthcoming, to just show in an international survey, 33% outside the United States, 66% across America and Canada, ultimately illustrated that the vast majority of people living with this disease or caring for people who have this disease say that food is one of the biggest, most important factors in their management of their disease. And that actually one of the criticisms of these low carbohydrate ketogenic diets is that they're unsustainable. Well, what we saw when surveying people on what diet they were what they were currently doing, that the low carbohydrate ketogenic diet so far outweighed the incidence of use than any other diet in the survey. Now, it could be biased. It could be, we might be only capturing a select group of people because of the way we collected it on social media. Who knows? But it was an international survey from people all over the world, going through doctors' clinics, and JDRF, which is now Breakthrough Type 1 Diabetes, also submitted it through their patient portal, which is actually where a lot of the people came into the survey. So this is really about an attempt to make it as unbiased as possible and really gain feedback from the average user of type 1 diabetes. And it clearly says that diet matters. We don't have guidelines for type 1 diabetes in the context of low carbohydrate strategies, where you do need to understand and have advanced awareness of how to you're not just lowering carbohydrates, Casey. Because in type 1 diabetes, you're also giving insulin, you need to know how to change insulin dose, but also the type of insulin you may be administering to now match those insulins with the food you're eating, because they're different, what they call kinetics. The glucose goes in at a much slower, prolonged rate with something like protein and fat than it does with something like carbohydrates, with or without fat. And so inevitably, that means changing your insulin strategy. These are incredibly important, as mismanaging insulin has massive consequences in the short term for a patient with type 1 diabetes. So ultimately, there's some key things that need to be done to help move the field forward. And that's a core mission of mine, is to not only answer the question in a rigorous manner about the efficacy and safety of these dietary strategies in the context of type 1 and outside of type 1 diabetes, but to then take that information and apply it to actually guiding clinicians to help patients. Because it's not that these clinicians don't want to do this, it's that they've been either uneducated or, frankly, it's not in the guidelines. I have talked to endocrinologists who are a friend of mine, Casey, who they themselves live with type 1 diabetes, and they themselves do this strategy and say, look, it's not in the guidelines. And so they're not per se handcuffed to not do it, because now the ADA it says individualized dietary strategy. But there are entities like the American Pediatric Association, or AAPS, American Society, I forget, but it's one of the pediatric associations, came out at Journal of Pediatrics, the leading pediatric society with the most members, said that they recommend against the ketogenic diet for kids with type 1 diabetes. And again, so you have these kind of conflicting messages that are out there on these dietary strategies. But it is important to also state that a lot of the risk and concern that drive something like the American Pediatric Society to not recommend this approach is also largely not evidence-based. They're almost completely based on assumptions on what's happened outside of type 1 diabetes may or may not apply to people with type 1 diabetes. And this is the same error that occurred with the dietary guidelines. In 1971, the first dietary guidelines from the American Diabetes Association came out, and they recommended 45% of total calories from carbohydrates. The only reason it was recommended is because they said explicitly that they felt that people with diabetes should have the same guidelines as those who didn't have diabetes. In 1979, they came out and stated that there was a clear critical nature to improving glycemic control and ultimately mitigating metabolic derangement. But then went on from 1979 to 1986 to recommend an even higher carbohydrate intake, again citing that the diet for people with diabetes should be the same as those without diabetes. except the fact that we know that someone with diabetes, both type 1 and type 2, do not respond the same as someone without diabetes in response to things like carbohydrate intake. And so this was a grievous error in the assumption that what is being done in the non-diabetic population should be done in the diabetic population. And the validation, the lack of studies to provide those recommendations, and still we have a lack of studies to provide those recommendations, just became dogma, and it became the recommendation. And we will find in due time, when we have these randomized controlled trials, whether that was how erroneous or maybe accurate it was. But to date, it appears that our analysis, as well as studies that have compared standard dietary strategies with just low carbohydrate, not very low ketogenic strategies, show improvements. So what it's clearly showing is that even if you don't have these perfect studies right now, but if you look at the weight of all the evidence to date, it clearly shows that the amount of carbohydrates you consume does matter in disease management for type 1 diabetes. And it also, those same things clearly seem to be implicated for things like type 2 diabetes, where we already know and have known from hundreds of trials that, I say hundreds, maybe a little over 100, that carbohydrate reduced diets have a therapeutic impact in that disease, to the point where it can help facilitate remission of type 2 diabetes, as defined by less than 6.5% HbA1c with or without metformin. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if that kind of puts that in a bow there, Casey, to just say that, yeah, obviously diet matters. There's no doubt about that. But how far-reaching the potential risks or concerns or benefits, how the total breakdown of that is to be determined. But patients are already doing it, and they're going to continue to do it because they don't want to live in the 99% of dysglycemia. They want to have normal health and have normal blood sugar levels, because the impact of dysglycemia affects how you feel every single day of the rest of your life. So there's really no way to it's an unavoidable and critically important question that must be talked about and must be addressed. And hence why I come on here, Casey, to talk about things like this and hopefully ultimately advocate for patients to have better health.
I love that you made the point that you wear the researcher hat and you also wear the advocate hat. And this has been such an amazing conversation. Unfortunately, I have a time restriction to prevent me from asking you about fat burning and performance. I would love to host you again so we could talk about some of that. But I would just like to say, like, I have been completely enthralled by this conversation. The research that you've done is incredible, and to be able to present that on stage and to be able to get this message out to people again, on the individual level, this is so important. And thinking back to these recommendations in the 70s and 80s, and all the people that have suffered needlessly because they didn't get the right information, they got recommended things that were not based on science. Your work is just so absolutely critical, and I love it. And so we would love to host you again on the show. I just have thoroughly enjoyed chatting with you today. For now, where would you like people to go to find you and connect with you in your work?
So you have not only, I think is Boundless, and what's the official title, Casey, for Boundless? What is it? Boundless Body?
Yeah, Boundless Body.
Yeah, I mean, you got boundless energy. It's super amazing,
So do you, man. I don't know who talks faster, you or I. We both talk pretty quick.
Well, I'll just say that you got boundless energy. So whatever you're doing for yourself is working for you, man. But yeah, so I have a website called my first and last name. It's Andrew Koutnik, AndrewKoutnik, PhD.com. I'm actually in the process of updating that to make it more accessible, more resources for people, and help to really start putting out more information to help people actually translate various tools into ultimately improving their health. So that's an active, ongoing process. There are resources there, but it will be much more robust in the next period of time. In fact, when this officially launches, it may be there. And I'm very active on Twitter or X at Koutnik, Koutnik. I'm on Instagram. I'm also working to kind of translate more of the lived experience and science of that. So that's Andrew Koutnik, PhD on Instagram. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm not on TikTok yet, but I probably will get on that as I start to navigate the waters of trying to translate the research we do to helping more and more people. and just educating people on what is out there and what may or may not be helpful on their journey to managing their metabolic health.
Well, I love that. I know you and I both don't love social media, but that's where people are, and that's where you can really impact people. So, Andrew, for now, thank you so very much for all of this amazing information, and thank you for taking time to be on our show today. We really appreciate you.
Honor, Casey, and thank you everyone for listening.
It was such an honor to host you. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.